Black Hawks don't lose altitude politely, and neither do the people trapped inside them. The Black Hawk was already bleeding altitude when the first round tore through the fuselage. Dr. Lena Voss had 4 minutes to keep a patient alive, 11 to get the bird airborne, and one problem no protocol covered. Someone out there knew the medevac route. Shadow pressed into her leg, reading a vibration the radio never would. Then Lena understood. They weren't hunting soldiers, they were hunting the medics. The cabin bucked again. Metal shrieked. Somewhere behind her shoulder, a fan of white powder blew through the torn skin of the aircraft. It was hard enough to sting any bare skin it found. Lena kept one gloved hand pressed deep into the casualty's chest anyway, forcing pressure against the failing source of the bleed. The flesh felt wrong, too cold already. Blood pasted itself to the worn leather at her knuckles in gummy, half-frozen strings. Her other hand kept the transfusion line from wrenching loose, though the clear tubing had gone rigid with cold. It was a plastic rod instead of something meant to bend. A medic across from her swore at the gauge, but Lena did not look up. Looking up never fixed a chest full of blood. The patient tried to drown on his own breath. Lena angled her wrist deeper and felt the shudder in the ruined lung. It was the weak kick that said the body was still trying. Stupid thing, brave thing. 4 minutes if she was generous. Maybe less. 11 before the pilot lost the narrow gap in the storm, and the bird became a coffin with rotors. The timing sat in her head like a split screen. Circulation, airway, temperature. Not as neat as the cards and laminated checklists love to pretend. Never neat. She glanced once toward the door, toward the wash of snow and the dark bones of broken concrete outside, and Shadow leaned harder into her thigh. 85 pounds. Black fur dense, with frost along the shoulders. Not a nudge. Confirmation. His ears twitched, then locked. He had picked up something through the deck, some faint translation of weight and movement beyond the roar. "They're here," she muttered, voice calm as a scalpel. "And they think we're just the medics." The crew chief heard her and went still for half a second, which was all the time fear ever needed to make itself useful. Lena pulled her hand free at last, not because the patient was safe, but because safe had left the aircraft 3 minutes ago. The blood on her glove went black in the red cabin light. She jammed a pressure pack into the wound, shoved the other medic's hand down over it, and forced him to feel exactly where the chest wanted to open and pour out. Hold there, not higher, there. No speech, no comfort. He nodded once, eyes wide and furious beneath ice-rimmed lashes. Good. Furious stayed warmer than scared. The IV line clicked against the frame when the helicopter lurched, stiff as a length of cheap plastic rebar. Lena snapped it free of a snag, saw the crystallizing slush moving inside it, and made the decision before command could clutter it up with questions. No long radio dance, no permission theater. The rounds had walked too close to the bird, too disciplined for random ground fire, and Shadow kept feeding her that low tremor through the metal floor. Someone outside was tracking the medevac, not guessing at it. She stripped a smoke canister from a side pouch, palmed the spare tourniquet hidden in her left glove out of old superstition more than need, then pressed 2 fingers under Shadow's throat for 1 beat. Steady pulse. Warm fur under freezing leather. Alive. Present. Hers to keep alive if the system had any say in it or not. She rose into the sway of the cabin and clipped one hand to the torn frame, while the other checked her sidearm, then checked it again by touch, because fingers lied less than eyes in red light. Wind screamed through the fuselage, hard enough to make every loose strap lash and every hanging buckle chatter. The pilot shouted something about the window closing. Lena only caught the numbers. 10 and dropping. Good enough. She slapped the crew chief's shoulder, pointed to the patient, then to the sky ahead. Get him out. Shadow shifted with her, shoulder brushing her knee, all dense muscle and silent focus. When she moved toward the open door, the cold hit full force, a blade drawn flat across her face. The world outside had narrowed to white violence, shattered concrete, and muzzle flashes, trying not to be seen. That was fine. Let them look at the only target moving away from the bird. Let them believe a medic peeling off with a dog was desperation and not math. Lena stepped out into the whiteout with shadow welded to her leg, and the first burst of residual fire bent toward them almost at once, exactly where she wanted it. The cold in the concrete came through her glove like a live wire. Lena dropped to one knee behind a slab of broken barrier and set the heel of her hand against the frozen ground. One tap. Pause. Two quick taps. Shadow felt it through paw and bone before the last pulse died under the wind. She did not need to look at him to know he had taken it. The first strike was never about speed alone. It was about silence, angle, and what a body could no longer do once the right structure failed. She mapped it the way she mapped a hemorrhage. Airway, voice, balance, blood. Same ugly tree, different patient. Snow sheeted across the wrecked perimeter in blinding bursts, turning muzzle discipline into guesswork. Good. Let the storm earn its keep. Lena slid along the concrete, keeping low, counting the enemy's last burst pattern in her head, the way she would count respirations. 3 from the left, 1 farther back, a watcher somewhere elevated, not firing yet. The first man had drifted too close to the helicopter's dead side. Rifle up. Confidence doing half the work for her. Shadow peeled away so cleanly, he seemed to come loose from her shadow instead of her body. Lena held still and listened, not for footsteps, for absence, for the little gaps trained men made when they thought they still owned the ground. The insurgent moved through the gray blur with the stiff caution of somebody who expected wounded medics to crawl, not hunt. Lena pressed her gloved fingers to the concrete again and sent one short correction through the frozen slab. Left blind spot, hold. Advance. The cold bit hard enough to numb the base of her thumb, then drove deeper, a needle all the way to the wrist. She let it. Pain was information. The man appeared in fragments through the whiteout, elbow, sling, half a beard iced over. The exposed strip of throat between scarf and jaw. Lena's breathing flattened. She could feel her own pulse in the old seam of the glove, could feel Shadow's timing in the space just before motion. Paper pushers call this routine funny, how none of them are here. The thought came out under her breath, dry as old gauze. Nobody heard it but the storm. Then Shadow hit him. No bark, no warning, no movie nonsense. Just 85 pounds of black muscle driving low and hard out of the snow. The impact took the man off his feet before the scream could properly form. Shadow pinned him heavily to the ground, jaws locking in tight to neutralize the threat. 3 seconds for surprise, 5 for panic. By 7, the fight was already leaving the body. The wind swallowed the wet sound so completely it might have been cloth ripping in another room. Lena moved the instant the rifle hit concrete. She crossed the gap in a crouch, boots skidding once, sidearms still down, because noise was for people who had options. Her free hand caught the enemy's sleeve and twisted him enough to keep the muzzle from clattering loud. Her mind worked the body the way it worked a casualty. Movement control gone. Breathing compromised. Target neutralized. Hands weak. Done. She dragged him into the lee of the broken barrier while Shadow released and reset without a sound, breath steaming in short white bursts. Blood spread dark across the snow, then started to crust at the edges almost at once. Out here, even dying got flash frozen. The first gap opened in the perimeter, right on schedule. That was the nice thing about men who trusted patterns too much. Take one away, and the rest of the line leaned crooked. Lena palmed the fallen rifle aside and pressed 2 fingers briefly to Shadow's neck. Fast pulse. Strong. His fur along the shoulders was packed with blown ice, and his weight came against her leg for half a second before he turned back toward the storm. Ready again. She tapped once more against the frozen concrete and felt the signal go out, faint and clean. Forward, another burst cracked from farther down the shattered ring. then another, badly aimed now, chewing at empty whiteness where they thought she still was. The first defensive seam had split. Men were shifting, calling to each other in short, clipped bursts that the wind mangled into nonsense. Somewhere beyond the collapse, shapes moved through the blur, more than one, maybe a patrol angling in to plug the hole. Lena saw the ghost of them between gusts and bared her teeth inside the balaclava. So the first man had been the perimeter, not the attack. Fine. That only meant the real work had finally decided to show itself. She flattened closer to the concrete, lifted one gloved hand, and waited for the next vibration to tell Shadow where to break them. Lena did not wait for the next patrol to find its nerve. She lunged sideways out of the concrete notch, hooked both hands under the metal lip of an abandoned medical crate, and heaved. The thing came over with a hard, ugly clang. It sounded too loud even under the wind. Old bandage packs and cracked plastic trays thudded inside as it rolled onto its side. Snow hit the exposed lid at once. White dust skittered across the dull metal, settling fast in the stamped grooves and half-torn inventory sticker. Good enough. Better than kneeling in the open and pretending frostbite was a tactical plan. She shoved the crate another 6 inches until it wedged against a broken support post, then dropped behind it, shoulder first. Her breath smoked through her balaclava. Shadow came in close, without needing to be called. He leaned his full weight into her leg, all 85 pounds of him, dense and solid and alive. It was enough pressure to remind her where he was, even when the storm erased everything else. The remnant firing farther out changed pitch when the snow thickened. That mattered. Cold held smell low to the ground, trapped burnt powder and blood in little pockets, and the whiteout kept chewing up depth and distance until men started shooting at guesses instead of shapes. Her teeth were chattering hard enough to make her jaw ache, so she gave it something to do. "I hear the train a-comin'. It's rolling round the bend." The words came out thin and ragged through clenched teeth, more vibration than song, a scrap of Johnny Cash torn in half by cold and adrenaline. She kept it low, barely enough for herself. The rhythm helped her pin the next tap sequence in place. Shadow's shoulder pressed harder into her calf when she shifted. She flattened one glove against the frozen ground beside the crate and worked the code in short, measured beats, careful not to waste motion. Hold, drift right, wait for the gust. The surface bit through leather and into bone, but pain kept the timing honest. She pictured the perimeter like a triage board in her head. One threat bleeding fast, one stable but armed, one hidden, maybe elevated. Treat the killer first. Delay the noise. Don't get sentimental about bodies that still wanted to make new holes in you. A round snapped past and smacked the crate hard enough to ring through the metal. Snow jumped from the lid in a white burst. Lena did not flinch. She counted the lag, the angle, the confidence in the shot. Professional enough to bracket. Too controlled for panicked militia spray. That thought went on a shelf. Later. If later existed. The next push came careful, which made it worse. No idiot rush. No boots thundering straight into sight. Just a slow pressure in the storm. Shapes tried to use the same broken geometry she was using. Men spread out the way trained people did when they expected resistance and did not especially enjoy dying. Lena sent 2 taps into the ground, then one more. Shadow peeled away from her leg, low and black against black, almost gone, until a gust backlit the muscle along his flank in silver snow. She rose just enough to bring her pistol over the lip of the crate. One shot only, timed with a burst of wind and another rifle crack from farther off. The round took a man high in the shoulder, not center mass. On purpose. He spun, lost his footing on the ice under the drift, and slammed into the ruined doorway of the aid station. That was all Shadow needed. The dog hit him low, drove him sideways, and the rest of the patrol checked up for one fatal second. Not because they were stupid, but because bodies pile awkward when the guy in front suddenly turns into an obstacle. Lena moved the crate an inch with her boot, changing the angle. Another rifle slug chewed the corner and sprayed rust flakes into her sleeve. She ignored it, sighted on the second shape, and put a round into the concrete beside his knee. He ducked exactly where the weather wanted him to duck. That was when the rout started. Not a dramatic break. Not men throwing rifles and running for their mothers. Just discipline, fraying at the edges. Calls sharpened. Spacing collapsed. One shooter overcorrected and fired blind into his own drift line. Another pulled back too quickly and left a scatter of brass glittering against the snow. Far more than a patient withdrawal should have cost. Lena felt Shadow slam back into her leg again, chest pumping, hot breath ghosting through her pant leg even in the cold. She gave him one hard touch along the neck without taking her eyes off the white blur ahead. The crate lid had gone almost fully white now. The storm patiently buried the only decent cover they had left. She hummed the line again, quieter this time, not because she liked it, but because rhythm kept her from thinking about the tremor trying to creep into her hands. The enemy line was bending away from the aid station, peeling back in short, disciplined bursts, and that was wrong. Too neat, too fast. Men like that did not abandon a lock without a reason. Lena leaned out just enough to study the churned snow, the dropped casings, the odd amount of fire they had spent for so little gain, and felt the first cold, ugly twist of suspicion settle in her gut. They were leaving behind more than a retreat. Lena left the crate when the firing thinned to spite instead of pressure. She cut across the drift line in a crouch, boots punching through crusted snow, and reached the first body at the edge of the aid station perimeter, just as a remnant round ripped low across the ground and sent a fan of white powder over her knees. The corpse lay half on its side, the body ruined, rifle trapped under one arm. Fresh snow settled into the torn fabric at the collar. She thumbed on her red penlight, and the beam turned the scene into something mean and underwater. Blood on the man's chest had gone crystalline at the edges, tiny black-red facets under the light. Not liquid anymore so much as a mineral, trying to remember being warm. The smell hit her even through the cold. Powder, iron, old oil, all sharpened by air so vicious it stripped the softness out of everything. Shadow stayed close, shoulder brushing her calf, facing outward into the white, not the body. Good dog. Lena swept the beam once, found the casualty tag half buried in frost on the man's rig, and pulled it free with her gloved fingertips. Ice crackled off the laminate. Another round hissed overhead, close enough to make her flatten for a beat. Snow spat into her sleeve from the impact somewhere behind her. She kept working. Her left glove was already blackened with her own frozen mess from the helicopter and the first kill site. She dragged 2 fingers across the clotting blood at the man's collar seam and lifted the sample into the light, watching the way it broke instead of smeared. Too cold for softness, good for preservation. Good for lies, too, if you didn't know what you were looking at. The entry pattern around the shoulder wound on the second body a few feet off did not match the loose, ugly drilling she had seen from Separatist rifles before. Tighter grouping, cleaner line, less panic in the angles. She shifted the penlight, checked the fabric tears. Then the impact on the ruined support post beside him. Spall, sharp, controlled. Not homemade junk, not battlefield scavenger nonsense. This doesn't fit. Ballistics aren't militia. The words came out flat, almost bored, which was how fear sounded after enough training. Snow blew across the dead man's chest and tried to erase the tag while she read it. Timestamp, transfer notation, triage, shorthand. Not enough by itself. But the cardstock was wrong. Too clean, too recent. Somebody had touched medevac paperwork who had no business getting near it. Shadow leaned in harder against her leg. 85 pounds of warning. As another remnant shot carved a trench through the snow 2 yards to her right. She shifted to the second body and went through it fast. Hands methodical, mind faster. Magazine count. Patch ghost on the sleeve. where an insignia had been stripped off. Glove wear inconsistent with a farm rifleman or some half-starved hill fighter dragged into ideology by cousins and bad luck. These men had been supplied, briefed, managed. She found a folded log sheet in a chest pouch, sealed inside a plastic sleeve, the kind med units used when they needed field paperwork to survive weather and blood. The sight of it made her pause, in a way the gunfire had not. Lena tucked the penlight between her teeth, thumbed the sleeve open, and read by the ugly red wash bouncing off the snow. Route abbreviations, timing windows, cargo, shorthand. Not full orders, but enough. More than enough. The medevac route had not been guessed from rotor noise or a lucky intercept. It had been handed over in pieces, buried in the kind of boring supply language nobody respected until people started dying around it. She followed one notation down with the tip of her glove. Her pulse slowed instead of rising now that the shape of the thing was visible. Medical resupply crate references. Transfer window. ROE notes. Clipped into a manifest line where they should never have existed. That was the trail, not chatter, not rumor. Paperwork. Then the name flashed at her, from the bottom margin, like a knife catching light. Lieutenant Rains. Not written large, not underlined, not confessing anything, because the dead never gave you the courtesy of clean answers. Just initials expanded beside a verification mark in the log. Neat and bureaucratic and obscene, in the middle of a frozen kill zone. Lena stared at it for one beat, then two, long enough for the cold to creep deeper into her trigger hand. A laser skimmed across the snow near the body, a thin red line slicing over the casualty tag, over the crusted blood on her glove, over the plastic sleeve in her hand. Sniper. Remnant fire, still out there, still patient. Shadow's weight slammed into her leg as he braced. The low vibration in his chest was more felt than heard. Lena folded the manifest, shoved it under her armor, and dropped flat as the shot cracked a heartbeat later, chewing a stripe through the drift where her head had been. Snow sprayed over the corpse. The tag flipped once and landed face up in the red light. Lieutenant Rains still burned in her mind brighter than the beam. That was the moment the ambush stopped being an attack and became an audit trail with teeth. Lena did not wait for the second sniper correction. She grabbed Shadow by the harness and drove both of them off the open drift line. Her boots skidded over wind-hardened snow until the ground pitched down into the black ribs of the pine stand. The trees took them the way a wound took pressure. Badly, but better than nothing. Needles hissed overhead. Branches snapped under the weight of the storm. Another shot came in from behind and shaved bark off a trunk close enough to spray her cheek with wet splinters. She shoved Shadow through a gap between two bowed saplings and felt the harness yank wrong in her hand. Not tension, catch. The frayed nylon on his right shoulder snagged on a broken limb, with a hard little crack that cut through the wind cleaner than the rifle report had. Shadow lunged forward on instinct, and the old scar under the strap tore open. Fresh blood welled dark into the thick black fur and vanished almost at once, swallowed at the roots. He did not cry out, "Good dog, bad damage." The wind shifted in the same heartbeat, carrying away the last clean line of scent from the aid station and bringing the radio net down with it. Her earpiece went from broken chatter to a flat wash of static, then to nothing but an ugly, teeth-on-foil hiss. 19 minutes, if the storm kept building the way it was. 19 blind minutes. Plenty of time for paperwork, to kill something living. Shadow planted, shoulder low, trying to work through the pain and keep tracking the blood thread ahead of them. Lena went with him 2 steps before the color on his flank stopped being imagined and became real. She dropped to a knee behind a fallen trunk silvered with ice and put one hand under his chest, one on the torn harness strap. The nylon was frayed to cords, where it had been riding that old scar for too many miles. Now it had sawn through the skin enough to start a steady microbleed. Not a dramatic gush, but the kind that kept going because cold lied about severity. Her glove came back wet and hot in a world that had gone all knives and frost. A round snapped through the branches over her head and dumped snow down the back of her neck. She ignored it and stripped off the left glove with her teeth. The CAT had been tucked inside against the wrist, flattened warm from her pulse, a habit she had picked up after losing someone because gear had been buried one layer too deep at the wrong time. Not a dog, that time. Worse, human partner, blood loss, a procedure followed just slow enough to count as compliant and just late enough to count as dead. That memory came back whole and mean. She shoved it aside. Not useful. Not now. She cut the ruined strap free with her trauma shears, working by touch more than sight. Shadow stood braced into the wind, breath pumping white, muscles twitching under his coat but never trying to pull away. Lena looped the tourniquet high across the shoulder where the tear and old scar met, angling it so it bit tissue without choking motion he would still need if they had to move fast. Canine anatomy never read the same as the diagrams once the fur was soaked and the body was shivering under you. She cinched the strap down, twisted until the bleeding slowed, then until it stopped, trying to bead through the hair. Not textbook pretty. Effective. Her fingers checked distal warmth as best they could through fur and storm. Then she forced herself into the rest of the sequence. Circulation, airway, temperature. Hypothermia was the sly killer out here, more patient than any sniper. She dragged her own body against his, using her chest and forearms to shield the wound side, while she pulled an emergency wrap from a cargo pocket and tucked it under the harness remnants. "Stay with me, Shadow, not letting you die for paperwork." The words landed low and hard. Not tender, not soft, just a contract spoken out loud because somebody had to mean something in this weather. The radio stayed dead. Static flared once, then vanished again into the storm, leaving her alone with the trees, the blood smell, and the saw blade wind cutting through every seam in her kit. Shadow leaned his weight into her when she finished the wrap. 85 pounds of heat under ruined nylon, the warm core of him fighting the freeze that wanted everything equally. She checked his gums with 2 fingers, felt for the rhythm under the jaw, watched the set of his ears. Pain? Yes. Shock trying the door? Yes. But still in the room, still with her. That was enough for the next minute. And sometimes, the next minute was the whole damn war. Lena slid the folded manifest tighter under her armor, reseated the pistol, and listened to the forest work around them. Pine boughs thrashing. Snow sifting off branches in soft body weight thumps, somewhere far behind. A shooter moving position with the patience of a man who believed the weather had already done half his job. She rose with one hand still on Shadow's neck until he found his balance under the new pressure of the tourniquet. No whine, no falter, just a tighter set to the shoulder and a darker line where the blood had frozen into the fur. The blackout had them both by the throat now. No command, no medevac, no one to blame later, but the people whose names were already starting to stack in her head. Lena looked deeper into the storm-broken pines and felt the old procedural fear come back, cold and efficient. Not that she would die out here, but that she would survive just long enough to watch a partner die because somebody had filed a route in the wrong place. The pines thinned without warning and spilled them into a frozen staging yard, cluttered with medical relief cargo. Pallets sat half-buried under drifted snow, tarps cracked and snapped in the wind like rifle fire heard through walls. A stack of IV bags hung from a bent transport rack where somebody had tried to shelter them and failed. Clear plastic bellies knocked together. Drip lines were stiff as wire in the cold. Lena dragged Shadow into the lee of a crate marked with faded trauma supply codes and went still. Movement crossed the white screen ahead of them. Not militia posture. Not panicked scavengers. 2 shadows, maybe 3, cutting careful angles around the cache with that same polite, ugly discipline she had seen at the aid station. Insider Recon. One of them stepped past the IV rack and paused to watch the snow, not the sky, the way a man did when he expected a wounded thing to leave sign close to the ground. Shadow's weight came against her good side, shoulder tight under the emergency wrap. The tourniquet made his gait shorter, but not useless. Lena eased a hand onto the nearest supply box and felt the wood hum faintly as another gust hit the stacked cargo. Good. Unstable enough to talk to. Dangerous enough to lie with. She studied the yard the way she would study a chest film held under bad light. Lines, pressure points. What would collapse first if struck in the right place? The recon team had set themselves smart, using the taller pallets for staggered cover while one man ghosted the flank beside the IV rack. Too smart to rush. Fine. She did not need them stupid. She needed them committed. Lena slipped a hand into a split cardboard case and found saline bags packed hard with partial freeze. One bullet into those at the right angle would burst liquid across the planks and turn the surface slick as glass. Another into the ratchet strap above would dump half a pallet and fill the air with enough debris and white spray to blind a trained man for one bad second. She touched Shadow's neck, then tapped once against the crate lid with a knuckle. Wait. The dog held, chest barely moving, black outline swallowed by shadow and snow. One recon man crouched beside a stack labeled plasma warmers and reached down to inspect a track she and Shadow had left in the crust. The other stepped where Lena wanted him, directly under the hanging bags. She raised the pistol just over the crate edge and breathed out slow. Paper pushers never see this. The thought came out so quiet the storm nearly kept it for itself. Her first shot punched through the lowest IV bag. The plastic burst with a sharp, wet pop, and freezing fluid slapped across the recon man's sleeve and the boards under his boots. He reacted exactly like a trained operator would, pivoting to cover. Only the ground went slick under him and stole the move halfway through. Before he could recover, Lena put a second round into the ratchet strap above the pallet stack. The strap snapped. Crates lurched. The whole rack of trauma supplies came down in a hammering cascade of boxes, tubing, and snow. The staging yard shuddered with it. Tarps flapped loose. A cardboard carton split on impact and sent gauze packs and foil blankets skittering like pale fish over the ice. Shadow launched through the collapse line in the same instant. 85 pounds of black force slammed low into the flank man just as he turned toward the noise. The impact folded him over a crate corner hard enough to blow the air out of him. No bark, no wasted motion. Lena moved from cover while the third shadow tried to clear his angle through the falling clutter. One careful shot, center of the upper chest, where armor gapped with movement, and the man dropped backward into a stack of boxed syringes that burst under him like brittle bones. Not an open firefight. Just 3 decisions, all final, packed into 6 seconds of chaos. The yard went quiet in pieces. First, the gunfire stopped. Then, the bodies stopped trying to be problems. Then, all that was left was the wind beating pineapple-patterned tarp against steel poles, and the drip of saline leaking from punctured bags onto the snow. Lena got to the nearest fallen recon man and rolled him enough to search the chest rig. No speech from him, not even a curse. Good. She did not need dying explanations. She needed artifacts. A ruggedized tablet rode in a padded sleeve under his coat, warm enough from body heat that the screen woke under her glove when she dragged it free. Shadow stood over the second body with his head low and his wrapped shoulder darkening by slow degrees under the makeshift bandage, but he kept his feet. Lena angled the tablet under the tarp shadow and scrolled through a stripped-down log interface. Transfer windows, route fragments, internal verification stamps, reigns, again, not as rumor now, but as process, threaded through access records, and med supply routing like rot through clean wood. Absolute proof. She was sliding the tablet under her armor when the device chirped once and threw a banner across the screen in cold block letters. Audit team incoming. For 1 second, the wind seemed to stop just so she could hear how ugly that was. Then Shadow leaned into her leg. The crate stack creaked somewhere behind them. And Lena realized the Recon team had never been the cleanup. They had been the courtesy warning. Lena dragged Shadow from the snowy staging yard into the relay station. She pulled him across the threshold and kicked the door mostly shut behind them as the wind howled outside. The place smelled like burned cable jackets, cold dust, and ozone sharp enough to sting the back of her nose. Frost had furred over the inside seams of the metal shell. Relay cabinets clicked and blinked in tired little spasms. Half alive, half cooked. A round slapped the exterior panel as she kicked the door mostly shut, and the whole station rang around them. Thin metal screamed under impact. Shadow stumbled once, caught himself, then leaned hard into her thigh. His breath pumped white into the stale electrical air. The wrap on his right shoulder had gone dark again, where the snag wound kept working around the pressure. Not a blowout. Worse in its own way. Sneaky. The kind of bleed that stole small amounts until small amounts became the whole problem. Lena dropped beside him on the rubberized floor, stripped open another elastic bandage with her teeth, and slid 2 fingers under the wet fur to find the tear. Warm blood against a frozen glove felt almost obscene. Outside, wind hammered the antenna mast and made the station skin shiver. Inside, she pinned the wound with her thumb, found the line of the scapula by touch, and started building a better pressure wrap. She threaded the bandage around Shadow's chest and over the shoulder in ugly, practical passes, pulling each turn flat so it would not bunch when he moved. Her left knee held him steady. Her right hand kept pressure where the old scar had split under the frayed nylon. He did not whine, just trimmered once through the ribs, then locked it down. Good. Lena checked for distal warmth as best she could through fur and cold, then reached for the relay console without letting go of the wound. The board had partial life in it. Enough power for status lights, system cues, and the sick little bursts of static that popped through the speaker with half-second delays. She did not need more. Patient coding was not a hack. It was a legitimate emergency flag, the kind built to jump the line when a body went from salvageable to gone. She opened the casualty interface, fed in identifiers from the medevac transfer fields, then folded the Recon tablet's route log into the packet as a linked artifact, instead of an attachment anybody could strip away later. Every step had to look real, because most lies died under their own laziness. Another shot tore across the relay shell and punched a dime-sized hole through the wall above the cabinet. Cold air, knifed in. Burned insulation smell got louder. Lena kept rapping, typing, counting, breathing. The speaker cracked alive with a wash of static, and then his voice came through, thinned by weather, and still smug enough to raise a pulse. "Dr. Voss, you are violating protocol." Lena cinched the last turn of bandage, tucked the tail under, and pressed both palms over the wrap for 3 hard beats until the seep slowed under her fingers. Then she keyed the outgoing field with the heel of one hand and answered without looking at the radio. "Protocol is bleeding out, Lieutenant. I'm stopping the hemorrhage." That was all the air he got. She did not argue ethics, did not explain the dead, the manifest, the medevac route, salted into paperwork by somebody who wanted clean audit optics more than live casualties. The log already said it better than she could. On the screen, route fragments, transfer windows, verification stamps, and Raines's own clearance trail locked together into a pattern so neat it made her stomach go cold. Another bullet ripped the antenna housing outside, and the relay cabinets coughed sparks blue-white into the room. Shadow flinched toward the sound, then settled under her hand when she pressed him back down. Lena watched the transmission buffer stall, recover, then ask for a cleaner burst path. That meant one ugly thing. The packet would clear only if she fed the damaged uplink a direct line from the exterior service hatch. She slipped the Recon tablet and manifest log into the relay queue. mirrored the packet onto the patient coding alert, and rose with one hand still on Shadow's neck. He pushed 85 pounds of heat and stubbornness into her leg. Shoulder bandaged, wound controlled for the moment, eyes fixed on her instead of the door. The service hatch lever had iced over. Lena hammered it with the butt of her pistol until it broke loose, then cracked the panel just enough to expose the uplink spine to the storm. Wind blasted in at once, white and hard and full of ice grains that stung like filings. A round hit the outer frame and shaved metal across her sleeve. She leaned into the gap anyway, braced one boot against the cabinet, and drove the resend command with her thumb. The board hesitated. Static swelled. Then the coding packet jumped from amber to red to transmitted. One tight burst slipping out through the damaged antenna before the next gust broke the signal again. Receipt mark. 2 bytes of acknowledgement. Tiny and ugly, but real. Lena shut the hatch and slid back down beside Shadow, just as another bullet punched through the station skin and buried itself in the far wall. Rains had his threat. She had her send. The relay went half dark around them, ozone thick in the air, and now survival was the only argument left. Outside the relay station, the world had been erased and redrawn as pressure. White packed every direction so completely that up, down, and distance stopped behaving like separate ideas. Lena could not see 10 feet. Most seconds, she could not see 2. Snow hit her goggles and hood in hard, slanting bursts, then spun back off the ground and came again from another angle. Sound was worse. The wind did not just drown noise, it chewed it flat. It turned boots, gunmetal, breath, and shifting cloth into one long animal howl. Lena dropped to one knee at the relay footing and drove her glove through the loose powder until she felt the harder skin of frozen ground beneath it. 1 tap, pause. 2 quick taps. The answer came back through contact, not hearing. Shadow's body touched her leg for half a heartbeat, then moved off and left a faint return pulse in the earth that traveled from her palm to her wrist. Good. Still reading. Still with her. Then the smell reached her between ozone and burnt cable. Copper, warm and bright, leaking again from the wound under Shadow's shoulder wrap. The temporary tourniquet had held the bleed down, not ended it. No time to fix it. Only the next 10 seconds, and whether they belonged to her or the men still moving in the white. The first second arrived through the ground, a step too heavy for wind, too careful for panic, carrying along the relay foundation from her right. Lena answered with one sharp tap and a drag of her fingers through crusted snow. Angle left, low target. In the second, Shadow launched. She felt the transfer of force before she heard anything. 85 pounds drove through packed drift and frozen dirt, hard enough to kick a dull shock into her kneecap. Third second, a rifle muzzle flashed once inside the white and vanished again. Not a sight picture, just a pulse of direction. Lena moved on it, sliding left along the relay skin while her free hand skimmed the metal and counted seams. Fourth second, another vibration hit the ground under her palm, lighter, retreating. Somebody trying to clear the lane and protect the shooter. Fifth second, Shadow's impact changed from forward drive to violent twist. He had the lead man. Good. That gave her one narrow path. Sixth second, Lena kicked the buried edge of a supply dolly she had noticed beside the station wall and sent it skidding blind across the ice. It slammed low into the second set of legs. With a clatter the wind almost swallowed. Weight shifted. Balance went. Seventh second, she drove forward behind the sound, shoulder first. Her pistol stayed tight to her rib cage so it would not be stripped in the dark. The world stayed white. The math stayed clean. Eighth second, her shoulder hit meat and plate carrier instead of air. The man folded sideways into the dolly and the relay shell together, his rifle trapped between body and metal. Lena ripped the weapon down by reflex and fired once into the drift where the first muzzle flash had been, trusting timing over vision. Ninth second, the shot came back as impact through snow and foundation. A body dropping hard, and then not moving hard enough. Shadow was still engaged with the first target. Not barking, just that wet grind of effort nearly lost under the gale. Lena turned toward it, found fur with one hand and a sleeve with the other, and used the trapped man's own momentum to finish the collapse. She drove him face first into a half-buried cable trench where packed snow gave way under his knees and took him down crooked. 10th second, everything that had been a fight became aftermath. One body dead under Shadow's weight. One broken against the relay footing, weapon gone. One farther out in the white, the shot having taken him when the muzzle flash betrayed him. Lena checked the ground for organized movement. Nothing. Her glove came away wet when she checked Shadow's shoulder. The wound had bled through again under exertion. A final hot line through black fur. He leaned into her anyway, absolute as gravity. She did not waste the silence. Keeping one hand on Shadow's neck, Lena crawled by touch along the relay footing until her glove hit a hard case, half buried under blown snow. Field terminal. Enemy side, weatherproofed, tethered by a cable, run toward the bodies. She dragged it free, found the latches by feel, and ripped the housing open. The screen inside glowed pale through the white, enough to show mirrored route data, audit staging, and an outbound cache still waiting for cleaner signal. Not anymore. Lena smashed the display against the relay foundation, ground the board under her boot heel, then yanked the cable free and fed the loose end into the drift until the connector vanished. Leak sealed on sight. No graceful recovery. Shadow pressed into her leg, shaking now in small, hard tremors from blood loss and cold. But he stayed upright because she was upright. She got one hand under his jaw, checked gum warmth, counted breath, then laid her palm flat to the ground one last time. No return threats, just wind. Then a clean electronic rise cut through the storm from inside the damaged relay behind her, thin but unmistakable. High-level command override had finally clawed through the whiteout. Lena turned toward the sound, with Shadow braced against her thigh, and understood that surviving the firefight had only bought them entrance to the next part. Fluorescent light had a way of making fresh blood look old and old blood look permanent. In the field interrogation room, it washed everything flat and cold and unforgiving. Lena sat on a steel chair bolted to the floor. One boot hooked around the leg of the other just to keep herself from moving for no reason. Shadow lay against her shin on the rubber mat, wrapped shoulders stiff under the temporary repair. Black fur still warm where her hand rested. Every few seconds, she pressed 2 fingers gently into the hollow of his throat and counted. Strong enough. Slower now. The room smelled of bleach, wet canvas, stale coffee, and the kind of forced heat that never reached bone. Dry blood darkened the cuff of her sleeve and the seam of her glove. Somebody had wiped the table. Somebody had not bothered with the walls. A dented steel panel still carried a brown spray line at knee height. Across from her sat a recorder, 2 blank forms, and a red folder, thick enough to mean trouble long before it was opened. No medals, no blanket, no one even pretending this was the part where the institution thanked its wounded. The door opened with a hydraulic sigh, and Captain Nora Black came in carrying the folder like it weighed nothing. Medium height, clean posture, face composed down to the millimeter. Not cruel. That would have been easier. Meanness had heat in it. Nora Black had refrigeration. She set the folder on the table, did not sit right away, and looked first at Shadow's bandaged shoulder, then at Lena's hands, then at the dried blood under Lena's nails where scrubbing had missed its mark. Assessment order. Not accident. Lena watched it happen and read the sequence for what it was. Damage, liability, witness. Only after that did Nora take the chair opposite her and fold her hands over the file. No condolences. No debrief theater. Just white overhead light cutting sharp lines into her face and turning her eyes into something reflective. Shadow's ear twitched once, but he did not lift his head. He was tired enough to sleep, disciplined enough not to. Lena kept her fingers on his pulse and waited. Power liked silence because silence made people feel it. She had learned that years ago and bled for the lesson more than once. Nora opened the folder. Inside were printouts, transfer logs, the relay packet, the recovered audit chain, and a single clipped memorandum already stamped with internal routing marks. That was the part that made Lena's mouth go dry. Fast paperwork meant the decision had outrun the facts. Rains would not be dragged under public light, not with medevac routing and audit optics tangled together in the same nest. He would be sealed off somewhere useful to the machine, stripped quietly, spoken of carefully, if at all. The program would be protected, because the program mattered more than the bodies it used to prove itself. Nora slid one page out with 2 fingers. This leak never happened, Dr. Voss. You and the K9 are compartmentalized for 6 months. Do not test the boundary. The words landed without inflection, which somehow made them hit harder. No anger, no triumph, just administrative weather. Lena looked at the page instead of the woman. Internal channel override authorization. Cross-index suppression. Restricted movement. Handler autonomy revoked. K9 unit retained under monitored status. There it was. Shadow would live. The program would survive. Rains would vanish sideways into a locked corridor. And she, who had dragged proof through a blizzard with blood freezing on her cuffs, would wear the punishment for clarity. She said nothing. That seemed to bother Nora less than agreement would have. Lena pressed 2 fingers to Shadow's throat again, counted the beat there, then let her hand drift up into the warm black fur at the top of his neck. He leaned, barely, not enough for comfort to look like weakness. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere outside, a cart rattled down corrugated flooring and a radio coughed out clipped code before going dead again. Nora added 3 more papers to the stack, each one another wall. Housing restriction, movement control, contact limitation. 6 months, written 6 different ways, by people who had probably never touched snow that wanted them dead. Lieutenant Rains has been relieved of active access, Nora said at last. Not arrested, not charged, relieved, a verb with gloves on. Lena almost laughed, but the sound would have taken more energy than she felt like spending. She signed where they told her to sign because the trap had already been built, and refusing would only make it smaller. When Nora stood, the red folder came with her, thinner now, decision converted into record. At the door, she paused just long enough to make the room colder by intention alone, then left them with the lights, the steel, and the closing click of a lock that sounded an awful lot like the start of another kind of cage. The interrogation room door opened, and the base gave them back to the weather without apology. Lena stepped into the flight line glare with Shadow tight against her leg, and the cold hit like something personal, sharp enough to peel the stale heat of the room off her skin in one pass. Snow moved sideways across the tarmac, under floodlights gone milky in the storm. Not the same blizzard as before. Fresh one. New teeth. The runway strips flickered through sheets of white and then disappeared again. Shadow's harness had been stitched where they could stitch it and tightened where they could not afford looseness. The repaired section still rode hard over the right shoulder, frayed at the edge, pulling just enough to remind her every few steps what 6 months of compartmentalized mercy would feel like. Lena stopped once under the lee of a cargo pallet, bent and pressed 2 fingers into the hollow of his throat. Steady beat, deep enough. His breath steamed slow and thick around her wrist. I hear the train a-comin', she hummed through pale, numb lips. The line broke apart in the wind before it could become song. They started walking again, because standing still on a flight line in northern weather was just another way of volunteering for damage. No escort. No ceremony. Somebody in command had decided that was cleaner too. Let the paperwork say she had been redirected to restricted quarters. Let the cameras, if there were cameras, catch nothing worth saving. Lena kept one hand low, where it could brush Shadow's neck or the top of his shoulder every other step. Physical check, habit, proof. The snow bit any skin it found, cut along the seam of her goggles, lodged in the stubble-fine cracks and around her mouth. Under the repaired harness, Shadow's muscles moved with that careful economy wounded working dogs had, saving what could be saved, spending only what had to be spent. He did not lag. He did not look back. The base around them was all floodlight glare, fuel stink, and dark silhouettes of aircraft sitting grounded like bad ideas waiting for a better excuse. Somewhere behind those steel walls, a memo already existed, describing tonight in the clean, dead language of containment. Lena knew how those memos read. Incident contained. Exposure limited. Program preserved. Nothing in them about the warmth of black fur under a freezing hand. Nothing about what trust cost when it had to live outside the paperwork. Compartmentalized. She rolled the word around in her head and disliked it on contact. It was a bureaucrat's way of pretending a leash was architecture. 6 months of monitored movement, supervised work, reduced autonomy, restricted channels. Fine. Names changed nothing. The harness still bit into Shadow's shoulder when the wind pushed him sideways, and he still corrected without complaint. She still checked his pulse every time they paused in the storm, thumb and forefinger finding the beat under fur and skin like she was taking attendance for the only loyalty that had held. Partnership, she thought, was one of those words institutions liked until it stopped being decorative. On forms, it meant handler efficiency, K9 retention, unit cohesion. Out here, it meant blood in the snow, a body leaning into yours when either one of you had reason to quit, and the ugly, quiet knowledge that the thing keeping both of you alive had never once been a directive from above. The new storm pushed harder across the runway, and Shadow pressed in closer, shoulder brushing her knee. Lena let him. The contact traveled up through bone and steadied something in her the fluorescent room had tried to flatten. At the end of the lit stretch, the flight line fell away into darker service ground and half-buried barriers. Beyond that, another curtain of white waited, thick enough to swallow one human and one dog without leaving much argument behind. Lena stopped at the edge of it and checked Shadow one more time. 2 fingers at the throat, hand sliding up into the warm ruff behind his jaw. Strong pulse, controlled breathing. Pain there, yes. Fear too, probably, same as hers. Not fatal. She adjusted the harness by 1/2 inch. Not enough to help much, enough to keep the stitch section from sawing deeper for the next 100 yards. Then she drew a breath full of fuel, ice, and coming weather, and let the old Johnny Cash line slip out again, faint and grainy in the gale. I hear the train a-comin'. Shadow moved when she moved. No command needed. Just the pressure of her hand leaving his neck and the shared understanding that punishment did not mean idle, only watched. They walked into the next wall of snow together, one set of footprints blurring into the other almost as soon as they were made, and the base behind them shrank into light, paperwork, and lies while the only thing that still felt true kept pace at her side.